Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, like it's engineering or something.
Yeah, exactly like engineering. Like if you
Yeah.
fall and break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an X-ray, and there is a very clear, jagged white line on a glowing screen.
Yeah.
The doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Right, it's entirely binary. The bone is broken or the bone is intact.
Exactly. It's clean. And frankly, it's comforting for us.
Oh, absolutely. We deeply crave that kind of visibility. I mean, human beings like things to be categorized, labeled, and just put into neat little boxes. It makes the world feel manageable.
But then you step into the world of human psychology, specifically the world of neurodevelopment and trauma, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Totally useless.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, to put it mildly, just murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You can't just take an X-ray of a coping mechanism, or personality shift.
Right, and that ambiguity is exactly why you are here with us right now. Welcome in to you, the curious mind, joining our conversation today.
We're so glad to have you here.
We really are. Now, just to set the stage for what we are doing, today you are tuning into Today in the Hypothesis.
Yes.
Our mission on this show is simple, but highly ambitious. We take an intensely dense stack of research, we lock ourselves in a room with it, and we distill the most mind-bending aha moments just for you.
So you can walk away with a fundamentally new understanding of how the world and your own mind actually works.
Exactly. And today's stack of research is particularly profound, isn't it?
It really is. We are looking at a comprehensive, sweeping synthesis titled The Dual Prism Theory of Dissociation by Victor H. Sertouche.
Right, and here is the core hook, the absolute paradox that we're going to be wrestling with today. I want you to really think about this for a second. When you or I hear the word dissociation, what immediately comes to mind?
Usually something negative.
Right. We almost always think of a psychiatric symptom. We think of a breakdown in mental functioning. We picture a glitch in the software, the structural failure that happens when the human brain simply cannot cope with reality anymore.
Yeah, that's the standard view.
But what if it's not a breakdown at all? What if what we call dissociation is actually a highly sophisticated evolutionary superpower?
That is the central provocative premise of the dual prism theory. It argues that dissociation is not a failure of the brain, but rather an active, brilliant psychological organizer.
Wow.
It acts quite literally like a prism. If you shine a light through a prism, it separates and amplifies the spectrum.
Right, like a rainbow.
Exactly. Sertouche argues that dissociation separates and amplifies the absolute extremes of human capability. On one end of the spectrum, it is the secret engine behind elite athletic performance and towering artistic genius.
Okay.
But simultaneously, on the other end, it magnifies our deepest, darkest vulnerabilities like chronic impulsivity and, terrifyingly, moral duplicity.
It is a mechanism that scales from the absolute peak of human creation, the greatest symphonies ever written, to the absolute bottom of human depravity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you told me before we started that to truly grasp the massive scale of this prism, we can't just look at modern clinical psychology.
No, we really can't.
We have to go on a massive interdisciplinary journey.
We do. To understand how one single mechanism can do all of this, we have to travel from the ancient mammalian brain down into the epigenetic DNA data of Holocaust survivors.
Wow.
Through the isolated minds of legendary artists and composers, and ultimately into the chilling psychology of the Nazi doctors who orchestrated genocide.
It's all the same mechanism.
It is the exact same neural mechanism operating across all of those vastly different contexts.
It is genuinely wild to think that the exact same biological switch is responsible for all of that. So let's start at the very foundation. Let's start with the biology.
Good place to start. To understand how the brain can pull off extraordinary feats of focus or terrible acts of detachment, we first have to understand the physical nuts and bolts machinery of how it unplugs from reality. So let's talk about the autonomic nervous system.
Let's do it. Our autonomic nervous system is basically the background operating system of our body, and it has a built-in evolutionary defense hierarchy.
Okay.
Usually when we are safe, we rely on what is called the ventral vagal state. This is social engagement.
So like what we're doing right now.
Exactly. If you and I have a disagreement, or if we encounter a minor threat, our first instinct is to talk our way out of it. We negotiate, we use facial expressions, we connect.
That's the top tier of the hierarchy, right?
Yes.
It's the most evolved human response.
Right. But if that fails, say the threat doesn't care about your negotiation, the system drops down a level and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in.
The classic fight or flight.
Yes, your classic textbook fight or flight response. Your heart rate spikes, your muscles tense with oxygenated blood, your vision narrows. You are violently mobilized for immediate physical action. You are going to punch the threat or you are going to sprint away from it.
But the research asks a critical question here. What happens when active survival strategies fail? Like, what happens when you are faced with a threat that you absolutely cannot fight and you absolutely cannot flee?
Like an inescapable predator.
Right.
Imagine a smaller mammal pinned down by a much larger one. Fighting will just get it killed faster, and fleeing is physically impossible.
Right. There is zero way out.
When escape is impossible, the nervous system makes a final desperate shift into a much older, phylogenetically ancient defense strategy.
And this is the freeze.
Yes. It drops into the dorsal vagal freeze state, which is clinically known as tonic immobility.
The complete shutdown.
The complete shutdown. This is a mammalian survival tactic designed to do three very specific things. First, it releases endogenous opioids to drastically reduce physical pain, assuming an attack is imminent.
That makes biological sense.
Second, it minimizes detection by predators by essentially playing dead, because many predators are biologically hardwired to only chase moving targets.
Oh, like a T-Rex in Jurassic Park.
Basically, yeah. And third, it conserves metabolic energy in case a window for escape miraculously opens up later. Subjectively, you experience what most people do, but it is actually the simultaneous explosive activation of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Your sympathetic system, the gas pedal, is absolutely redlining. You are on the highest possible alert, the engine is roaring.
But you're not moving.
Right, because simultaneously, the parasympathetic system, the heavy brakes, takes dominant physical control. It induces profound bradycardia, which is a massive, sudden deceleration of the heart rate.
Wow.
Your breathing becomes rapid but incredibly shallow, so you aren't making noise, and your pupils dilate massively to take in as much visual information as possible without having to move your head.
So your internal engine is revving to 1,000,000 RPMs, dumping adrenaline and cortisol into your system, but the brakes are locked so tight that you are not moving a single millimeter.
Exactly.
The sheer internal tension there must be agonizing.
What's fascinating here is how the brain actually handles that agonizing tension to prevent you from experiencing the full subjective horror of the situation.
It does something to protect you.
Yes. It initiates a literal physical decoupling within the brain's architecture. Deep inside the brain, in an area called the posterior medial cortex, a slow 3 Hz oscillation begins.
Now, 3 Hz oscillation, that's a delta wave, right?
It is.
That's the kind of brainwave we usually only see when someone is in deep, dreamless sleep.
Exactly. It's a very slow, deep rhythm. But here, it is happening while the organism is wide awake and terrified.
That is so weird.
It is. This 3 Hz rhythm essentially acts as a localized neurological anesthetic. It functionally disconnects the posterior medial cortex from other major cortical hubs. This area of the brain is heavily involved in our sense of self, our spatial awareness, and our integration of sensory inputs.
So it literally unplugs the sensory cable.
It pulls the plug, and
Yeah.
subjectively, this physical decoupling is what creates the profound psychological feeling of depersonalization and derealization.
Like you're not real.
You feel completely detached from physical reality. People who have survived extreme trauma often report feeling like they were floating above their own body or watching a movie of their life play out on a screen rather than actually experiencing it.
Wow.
The brain is essentially saying, look, this reality is too horrific to process, so I am going to separate you from your physical body. This allows the organism to tolerate highly distressing, inescapable experiences without the mind shattering completely.
Now, in the wild, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
An animal plays dead, the predator loses interest and walks away, and eventually the animal shakes it off, the nervous system resets, and it goes back to normal.
Right, it's temporary.
But humans are incredibly complex social creatures.
Yeah.
The research talks about how this temporary biological defense mechanism becomes pathological, especially in children, through something called the fawn response.
Yes, and this is where the survival tactic becomes a chronic trap. When trauma occurs repeatedly in early childhood, say, in an environment of chronic domestic abuse or living with a highly volatile alcoholic parent.
It's not just a one-time predator.
Exactly. This temporary biological defense mechanism hardwires itself into a permanent coping style.
Because the inescapable predator is their own caregiver.
Precisely. A child cannot fight a dominant caregiver, and they cannot flee the house because they rely on that caregiver for food and shelter.
They're trapped.
So their nervous system morphs the freeze response into the fawn response. They shift into a state of passive submission. Their entire neurobiology becomes prioritized around complete, unquestioning compliance with the abuser in order to survive.
That is heartbreaking.
They learn to entirely suppress their own somatic needs. They ignore their own hunger, their own pain, their own exhaustion. Instead, they maintain a chronic, exhausting state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning the environment to predict what the abuser wants or what mood they're in so they can preemptively placate them.
Which brings up a massive, daunting clinical question for me. Let's say that child grows up, they become an adult, and they are sitting in a therapist's office.
Right.
Their brain is essentially stuck in that childhood state, with the internal engine revving, the brakes slammed on, and the sensory cables unplugged. How do clinical interventions even begin to address a brain that is trapped in that physical paradox?
It is incredibly difficult.
I mean, you can't just talk them out of it,
Right.
right? You can't just logically explain to them that they are safe now.
You absolutely cannot just talk them out of it, and this is where traditional talk therapy often hits a wall with severe trauma.
Because of the 3 Hertz oscillation.
Exactly. Cognitive logic, verbal reasoning, understanding that you are in a safe room in the present day, that all happens in the prefrontal cortex. That's the most evolved part of the brain. But remember that physical decoupling.
Yeah.
The prefrontal cortex is literally physically disconnected from the emotional and sensory centers when someone is in a highly dissociated state. The logic literally cannot reach the fear. The wires are cut.
Wow. So the therapist is speaking to a part of the brain that has no connection to the part of the brain that is actually panicking.
Precisely. The language center is online, but the survival center is deaf to it. So clinicians have to bypass the cognitive brain entirely. They have to use body-based somatic grounding techniques. They have to work from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Okay, so what does that actually look like in practice?
It involves intense tactile engagement.
Yeah.
A therapist might have the patient hold a piece of ice or feel a piece of rough sandpaper or press their feet aggressively into the floor.
So very physical stuff.
Highly physical. It involves exposure to strong anchoring smells like peppermint or ammonia. It involves very specific, heavily regulated, deep breathing exercises designed to manipulate the vagus nerve.
So forcing sensory data into the system.
Yes. Overwhelming the system with undeniably safe, present moment physical data. All of this is designed to send strong signals of physical safety up through the spinal cord into the body to actively downregulate the overactive amygdala.
Trying to convince the body it's safe.
You are trying to prove to the primitive mammalian brain that the immediate physical threat is gone. Only when the primitive brain believes it is safe will it finally take its foot off both the gas and the brake, stop that 3 Hertz oscillation, and allow the prefrontal cortex to reconnect.
That is incredible. Okay, so we've established the physical machinery. We understand how the body disconnects from the present moment to survive extreme, inescapable stress.
Right.
But if this decoupling destroys our ability to stay present, how does it affect our future? What happens when that temporary physical defense hardwires itself into a permanent way of making life choices?
That's a big question.
The research suggests it completely alters our relationship with time itself, specifically our financial and economic future.
It alters it devastatingly. When you live in a constant state of dissociation, you are trapped in the immediate present. And to understand why this destroys long-term planning, we need to look at the CNDS. That's the Competing Neurobehavioral Decision System Theory.
I love this model. The CNDS sounds like a dense piece of jargon, but it's actually a really elegant, intuitive way of looking at how we make every single choice in our lives.
It really is. It essentially models all of our decision-making as a constant, ongoing tug of war between 2 entirely different neural networks in the brain.
Okay, who's on the rope?
On one side of the rope, you have the limbic system. This includes the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the insula. This is the ancient, reward-driven, hyperreactive, deeply emotional center. It wants safety, it wants calories, and it wants reward, and it wants them right this exact second.
It's the ultimate gratification engine.
Yes. On the other side of the rope, you have the executive system, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the sophisticated planner. It thinks about the future, it evaluates long-term consequences, it considers social ramifications, and it actively inhibits impulses.
So in a healthy, safe environment, these two systems are constantly balancing each other out. Let's say you are at a party. The limbic system sees a massive chocolate cake and says, I want to eat that entire cake right now because it's high in calories and fat, which is great for survival.
Typical limbic system.
Right. But the executive system pulls back on the rope and says, let's just have one slice, because if we eat the whole thing, we are going to feel physically sick tomorrow, and we will look ridiculous in front of our friends.
Exactly. That friction between the two systems is healthy decision-making. But chronic dissociation completely severs that balance. It creates what researchers clinically call a hyper-impulsive, hypoexecutive state.
Because of the unplugging we talked about.
Yes, because dissociation unplugs the prefrontal cortex to survive the immediate moment, the executive system is starved of connectivity. It drops the rope. And the limbic system takes total, uncontested control of your behavior. And we can actually measure the consequence of this mathematically through a behavioral economics concept called temporal discounting.
Yes, the math. I loved this part of the paper because it took this abstract psychological concept and quantified it. It provided a formula.
Then a discount function.
Right. V equals A over the sum of 1 plus K times D. Now, for you listening, don't worry, we aren't doing a pop quiz on calculus.
We're going to math test today.
But we are going to explain why this simple formula is basically a map of human impulsivity.
Right. It's a brilliant way to map how we value things across time. So let's break it down. V is the subjective value of a reward to you right now, in this moment.
Okay, what the thing is worth to me right now.
Exactly. A is the actual objective amount of the reward. D is the delay, meaning how long you have to wait to receive it. And K is the critical variable here. K is your personal idiosyncratic discount rate.
So everyone has a different K.
Yes. A higher K value means your brain drastically, steeply devalues a reward if you have to wait for it.
Okay, let's put some real numbers to this so we can visualize it. If I have a high K value and you offer me $100 today, or you offer me $150 a year from now,
what do?
my brain looks at that $150 in the future, applies that steep discount rate, and says, that future money is basically worthless to me. So I take the 100 today, even though mathematically I'm losing out on $50.
Precisely. You sacrifice a larger future gain for a smaller immediate one. And the data in the synthesis shows unequivocally that a history of trauma and chronic dissociation independently predicts a massive spike in that cake value.
It skyrockets.
It does. Dissociation literally destroys the brain's ability to assign emotional value to future resources.
Now, I want to push back on this, or rather, I want to challenge how society usually frames this behavior.
Go ahead.
Wait, are we letting people off the hook here? Is this biological math basically giving a free pass to terrible financial decisions? Because society heavily judges people in poverty or people struggling with addiction for making these bad, impulsive choices.
We judge them constantly.
We judge them for taking out predatory payday loans with insane interest rates, for not putting money in a savings account, for making incredibly short-sighted decisions that keep them trapped in a cycle. But based on this math, if your brain is trapped in a biological survival mode, it is actually highly logical to prioritize the immediate short-term reward.
It is entirely logical from a biological standpoint. It is an evolutionary adaptation applied to a modern socioeconomic problem.
Right, because the brain thinks it's still in the wild.
If you grow up in an environment of high financial instability, unpredictability, and chronic threat, planning for a future that might not exist is biologically inefficient. If you are a starving animal, you don't bury the meat for next winter. You eat it now because you might be dead tomorrow.
The brain prioritizes immediate survival.
Always. The problem is, modern capitalism demands long-term planning, so the biological adaptation becomes an economic death sentence.
And the data on the socioeconomic realities surrounding this is stark. It's not just a few people struggling, it's a systemic issue.
It's deeply troubling. The research highlights that childhood financial instability directly correlates with adult anxiety and chronic loneliness. The brain learns early on that the world is unsafe and unpredictable.
And it mentioned marginalized groups specifically.
Yes, and when we look at marginalized groups, individuals who identify as disabled, neurodivergent, or non-binary, the synthesis points out that their poverty rate is double that of the general population, sitting at 22.9%.
That is a staggering number.
It is, and it means they are subjected to immense chronic systemic stress. They are constantly fighting for basic survival, which constantly triggers that dissociative short-term survival mechanism. You cannot ask a brain to build a 5-year financial plan when it is terrified of how it will survive the next 5 days.
And the paper also breaks down how this systemic stress manifests completely differently differently across genders, which I found really revealing about how our society structures our coping mechanisms. It's not a one-size-fits-all response.
No, the systemic vulnerabilities heavily dictate how the dissociative response expresses itself. For men, the societal pressure of hypermasculine performance norms often punishes emotional vulnerability.
Right, you're told to man up.
So, the dissociation tends to manifest as externalizing behaviors. We see higher rates of substance misuse, hyperaggression, and risk-taking. This is structurally reflected in the fact that men account for 56% of the homeless population.
Because they push the pain outward.
Yes. They face immense societal barriers to seeking psychological help, so they externalize the trauma until it physically displaces them.
Whereas women are facing a completely different structural trap.
Completely different. The societal expectation for women often revolves around caretaking and maintaining the social fabric, regardless of personal cost. Women are disproportionately pushed into precarious part-time work, making up 68.5% of that workforce, and they overwhelmingly head single-parent households at 79.8%.
So they're carrying the entire economic and emotional burden of a family unit, often with half the resources.
Exactly. And this structural polarization forces a different kind of dissociation. They can't externalize. They can't just abandon the family or act out
We
aggressively.
have to keep the ship afloat.
So they turn to chronic emotional suppression, intense hypervigilance, and severe role compartmentalization. They internalize the distress to keep the family functioning on a day-to-day basis.
But that has to take a toll.
A massive toll. This constant, low-grade dissociation leads to a rapid depletion of both financial and emotional reserves over the long term. They are surviving, but they are hollowing themselves out to do it.
So if we synthesize this, dissociation uncouples the emotional meaning of future consequences from our current choices. It starves the development of working memory and cognitive flexibility.
Yes.
It traps you in a hyper-impulsive present. It is a total devastating liability when it comes to navigating modern economic life.
It is a devastating liability. It destroys wealth building. It destroys long-term health planning. It undermines relationship stability. But, and this is the massive pivot of the dual prism theory,
Here's where it gets really interesting.
that exact same neural mechanism, the physical decoupling of emotion and executive function, the shutting down of external reality, the uncoupling of the prefrontal cortex, when that exact same biological state is pointed at a singular, non-threatening task rather than a threat,
Wow.
it is the secret engine of human genius.
Yes, we are moving from the liability to the amplifier. The paper draws this incredible counterintuitive link between clinical dissociation and what positive psychologists call flow.
Flow is a concept popularized by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It is that state of deep, effortless absorption in an activity.
Like being in the zone.
Exactly. You have probably experienced it while playing a sport or coding or painting or reading a great book. In a flow state, you completely lose track of time. You lose your sense of physical fatigue or hunger, and most importantly, you lose your sense of self-consciousness.
You merge completely with the task.
Exactly. Now, neurologically, brain imaging shows that both clinical dissociation and healthy flow states share a massive reduction in the activity of the default mode network.
Let's unpack the default mode network because that is a crucial concept. The DMN is essentially the part of the brain that generates our ego, right?
Yes, the self.
It's our self-referential thinking, our inner critic, the part of us that worries about what we look like or what we are going to have for dinner.
Yes. The default mode network is the brain's idling state. When you aren't doing anything specific, the DMN is active, constantly generating the narrative of you. But by turning off the DMN, by turning off the self-friction, you remove the immense psychological friction of self-doubt and distraction.
You just execute.
You enter a state of pure, uninterrupted cognitive execution. And historically, some of the most eminent creators in human history were essentially weaponizing their own highly developed dissociative tendencies to achieve this exact state.
I was absolutely floored by the historical examples in the text. I mean, it completely reframes how we think about the muse or artistic inspiration. Let's talk about Giacomo Puccini.
Puccini is one of the greatest opera composers of all time. He composed Madame Butterfly.
A masterpiece.
And his documented, subjective experience of writing that masterpiece was profoundly dissociative. He didn't describe it as hard work or careful planning. He claimed that the music was quite literally dictated to him by God.
He externalized his own artistic agency.
Completely.
He was in such a deep, decoupled trance state that his conscious, waking mind didn't even recognize or take credit for the work his subconscious was producing. He felt like a stenographer for the divine.
Precisely. His default mode network was so suppressed that the Puccini identity vanished, leaving only the pure output of musical creation. And then look at the literature world. Look at Charles Dickens.
Oh, this one was wild.
Dickens was known to fall into intense, almost hallucinatory, empathetic trances while writing in his study. He didn't just sit at a desk and invent characters as a cognitive exercise. He interacted with them.
He would talk to them.
He would pace his room, speaking aloud, arguing with them. He famously referred to David Copperfield as his favorite child, viewing the character almost as a living, autonomous entity completely separate from his own mind.
That is a highly developed, compartmentalized, dissociative state. It's almost like a controlled psychological splitting, where part of his brain became David Copperfield.
It is a controlled split, and the paper also mentions Robert Schumann, the legendary classical composer.
Right?
His immense creative output was deeply tied to severe manic-depressive cycles. He would enter these extended states of hyper-focus, almost manic productivity, completely detached from his physical needs. Not eating, not sleeping, just writing, producing absolute masterpieces, only to suffer a complete, devastating somatic collapse afterward.
Which brings up a really critical inductor for this state. How do everyday people who aren't Charles Dickens or Puccini access this?
Music.
Right. The research points to music. Music is arguably the most effective, universally accessible tool for inducing dissociative absorption in the modern world.
It is incredibly powerful. It's highly portable, especially now with headphones. It has deep semantic ambiguity.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning instrumental music doesn't have a rigid, literal definition. It can mean whatever you need it to mean emotionally in that moment. But most interestingly, neuroimaging shows something fascinating about what music does to our physical bodies. Listening to deeply engaging music significantly reduces eye movement activity.
Now, why does eye movement matter?
Because constant eye movement, saccadic scanning, is how our primitive brain scans the external environment for threats. When you reduce that eye movement, you force the brain to stop processing external visual reality.
It forces a shift from external awareness to internal thoughts, memories, and mental imagery. You put on noise-canceling headphones, you close your eyes, and you are actively utilizing a mild, self-induced dissociative state to regulate your emotions and detach from a stressful commute or a noisy office.
Yes, it is a controlled retreat inward. But the research makes a very sharp, crucial distinction here regarding the danger this poses for professional musicians. It notes that UK freelance musicians actually rely on performance-based dissociation as a vital tool to manage severe stage fright.
Right, because if you are terrified of 1,000 people staring at you, the easiest way to perform is to decouple from the reality that they are there. You enter a trance where it's just you and the instrument.
They do. But the data reveals a dangerous vulnerability based on the type of artist you are. Performing artists, the interpreters, like actors, orchestral musicians, and dancers, actually suffer from significantly higher rates of clinical depersonalization and derealization than the generators, like composers, painters, or playwrights.
Why is that? Why does the actor suffer more than the playwright?
Because an interpreter has to repeatedly abandon their own identity to embody someone else's, and they have to do it using their literal physical body as the instrument, often under the immense real-time pressure of public scrutiny.
Oh, that makes sense.
A writer can dissociate in a private room. An actor has to dissociate on a lit stage. While a mild dissociative state can help them bypass stage fright in the moment, compulsively relying on pathological dissociation eventually degrades working memory and impairs the fine physical motor control required for elite performance.
The unintegrated trauma eventually sabotages the very skill it was trying to protect.
Exactly.
The literature actually reflects this struggle with compartmentalization too, right? The paper brings up Doris Lessing's incredible book, The Golden Notebook.
Yes, The Golden Notebook is a brilliant literary exploration of this exact fragmentation. The protagonist has different colored notebooks for different parts of her life. One for politics, one for relationships, one for art, because she feels she cannot integrate them into a single, cohesive self without breaking down.
Yes, to keep them separate.
Lessing was heavily criticizing how modern society forces us to rigidly separate these spheres, preventing true psychological wholeness.
And the paper also mentions Graham Greene's The Human Factor, where a bureaucrat uses the clean, sterile lines of abstract art to compartmentalize his mind, creating a safe mental space so he doesn't have to feel the crushing moral responsibility for his corrupt political actions.
A fascinating use of art as an escape.
Which makes me wonder, and this is the question for anyone who uses deep work to cope, where is the line Where is the line between a healthy, highly productive flow state and a dangerous dissociative escape?
It's a thin line.
If both states rely on turning off the default mode network and unplugging from the present, how do you, as a creator or just a person working at a busy desk, know when you've gone too far?
That is the million-dollar question for modern productivity. And the distinction lies entirely in the aftermath, the integration phase.
Okay, so what happens after?
Exactly. A self-regulated, healthy flow state is deeply restorative. When you emerge from a flow state, you feel a sense of accomplishment, your emotional resilience is built up, and crucially, you are still connected to your body's needs. You might be hungry, but you notice you are hungry.
Right. Feels good.
But a compulsive reliance on flow-using work or artistic immersion purely to escape unresolved trauma, chronic stress, or a painful reality is marked by severe physical neglect during the immersion and a profound, agonizing post-immersion somatic collapse.
You crash.
You don't just feel tired, you crash, you get sick, you feel hollowed out, because the underlying nervous system was actually redlining the entire time, just like we discussed with the animal in the freeze response. You weren't resting, you were hiding.
That makes so much sense. It's the difference between using a tool to actively build something versus using a tool to hide inside a box.
Beautifully put.
So we've looked at how individuals like Dickens or Puccini channeled this immense state in isolation in their private studies or at their pianos. But historically, entire societies had to figure out how to manage individuals who possess this intense, volatile, dissociative psychological energy.
And they didn't just ignore them.
No, they didn't just send them to an outpatient therapy clinic. They culturally institutionalized it.
They gave it a deeply embedded cultural blueprint. When anthropologists look at how altered states of consciousness are channeled globally across human history, they draw a vital distinction between two ends of the dissociative spectrum: trance and ecstasy.
Let's clearly define those, because I think in casual conversation we use the words trance and ecstasy completely interchangeably.
We do use them interchangeably, but clinically and anthropologically they are near opposites.
Okay, what's trance?
Trance is a highly dynamic, active state. It usually involves heavy sensory stimulation, loud, rhythmic movement, dancing, chanting, intense social interaction.
And ecstasy.
Ecstasy, on the other hand, is silent, static, and deeply introverted. The physical body is completely still, often rigid, while the mind journeys inward.
Okay, so how did ancient cultures organize these wildly different states?
They largely divided them into two institutional categories, and this division was heavily based on the complexity and the social hierarchy of the society itself.
What was the first category?
The first category is the shamanic trance, or what anthropologists call the non-possession trance. We see this predominantly in simpler, flatter, egalitarian, hunter-gatherer societies, and historically, this specific role was male-dominated.
And what happens in this state?
In a shamanic trance, the practitioner, the shaman, retains their personal agency. They are the active driver of the experience. Their souls believed to leave the physical body and travel through spiritual dimensions to negotiate with spirits for the benefit of the community, to achieve healing for a sick person, to locate game during a famine, to solve complex tribal problems.
The text mentions specific cultures like the Samami people in Finland or the Koryaks of eastern Siberia. They would use prolonged, intense rhythmic drumming or even ingest psychotropic substances like the Amanita muscaria mushroom to chemically and rhythmically induce this highly controlled, active dissociative journey.
Yes. The key there is that it is controlled, and the practitioner is the active celebrated agent. They hold power. Now contrast that with the second category, the possession trance.
Where do we see this one?
We see this emerge in much more complex, highly stratified agricultural societies with steep, rigid social hierarchies. And crucially, unlike shamanism, these possession cults are disproportionately, overwhelmingly female-dominated.
Now, why is that? Why the gender shift as society gets more complex?
Because women in those heavily stratified agricultural societies were facing much higher levels of systemic psychosocial trauma, economic dependence, and rigid oppression. They had very little socio-political power.
And the nature of the trance perfectly reflects that lack of daily agency.
Exactly. In a possession trance, the individual is not an active traveler. They are a passive vessel being taken over. It is characterized by sudden, uncontrolled onset, massive somatic convulsions, speaking in different voices, and subsequent total amnesia of the event.
They don't remember any of it.
Nothing. The cultural belief is that an external spirit, a god or an ancestor, has violently entered and commandeered the body.
This is where I want to connect this directly back to you listening to this right now, navigating the modern world and thinking about how we handle mental health. Think about how utterly brilliant this ancient cultural engineering was.
It was genius.
Instead of letting highly stressed, traumatized, marginalized individuals just suffer alone in a corner, stuck in a biologically destructive dorsal vagal freeze state, these ancient cultures recognized the vulnerability and they gave it a profound social purpose.
Yes.
If a marginalized woman in a rigid patriarchy spoke out against her husband or the leaders, she would be punished. But if a powerful spirit possessed her body and spoke those exact same grievances, the spirit was speaking and she was blameless.
Completely blameless.
They literally built a career path, a respected social role for the dissociated mind.
It perfectly validates the dual prism theory. What is fundamentally a psychological liability, high psychosocial stress resulting in severe structural dissociation, is completely inverted by the culture into a systemic strength.
A superpower again.
Right. The community gets spiritual authority, cohesion, and leadership, and the traumatized individual gets a socially sanctioned, protected release valve for their trauma.
It's incredible. Yeah. But, and this brings us to a darker reality. What happens when that trauma isn't culturally integrated? What happens when a massive structural trauma occurs in a modern context that doesn't have a shamanic framework or a possession cult to process it safely?
It's devastating.
The research shows that unintegrated trauma doesn't just vanish into the ether. It physically, biologically, rewires the biology of the next generation.
It does. It leaves a transgenerational blueprint. And before we get to the massive generational data, the clinical research on childhood trauma shows us how this fragmentation begins within a single lifetime. And again, it heavily follows gendered pathways.
Like we saw earlier with homelessness.
Yes. When children are exposed to severe, complex trauma, boys are statistically much more likely to externalize. They show hyperaggression, delinquency, acting out violently against the environment. They push the pain outward.
And the girls.
Girls, conversely, tend to internalize the trauma. We see the development of things like quiet borderline personality disorder, profound emotional numbing, severe relational avoidance, and major depression.
They hide it.
They retreat internally to maintain a compliant, acceptable outward appearance while suffering immense chaotic internal distress.
Which is a profound form of structural dissociation.
Yeah.
But the most intense, undeniable data on how this structural division of the self transcends a single lifetime comes from the Holocaust survivor data.
It is some of the most sobering, vital epigenetic research we possess as a species.
It's heavy.
Following World War II, clinicians began observing extreme compartmentalization and unique trauma responses in survivors. In the 1940s and 50s, before PTSD was an official diagnosis, they coined early terms like Buchenwald syndrome and KZ syndrome to describe the chronic anxiety, violent night terrors, and severe emotional numbing that plagued survivors for decades after liberation.
And the dissociation was so severe that the text mentions a specific study of Birkenau child survivors who experienced profound dissociative amnesia. They literally lost all memory of their years in the death camps.
Total blank.
Their brains just forcefully wiped the hard drive to survive the present.
They erased the narrative. But the body kept the score, and it passed that score on biologically. This is where we look at the biological footprint, specifically the epigenetic changes in a gene called the FKBP5 gene.
Let's explain epigenetics real quick.
Epigenetics is essentially the study of how your behaviors and your environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. They don't change the underlying DNA sequence. You are still human. Your genes are the same. But epigenetics changes how your body reads a DNA sequence. Think of it like a volume knob on a specific gene.
Okay, so the instructions are the same, but the volume is turned way up or way down based on what you live through.
Precisely. Researchers looked at a specific intron on the FKBP5 gene, which is heavily involved in regulating the body's glucocorticoid receptors. Basically, it controls how your body responds to and shuts off stress hormones like cortisol.
Okay.
In the first generation, the actual Holocaust survivors who lived through the camps, they found 10% higher methylation of this gene site compared to controls who didn't experience the Holocaust.
What does methylation mean here?
Methylation is a chemical process that basically tightly winds up the DNA so it can't be read easily. This higher methylation locked the trauma in, keeping their stress response chronically suppressed or altered as a necessary daily survival mechanism in the camps.
Now, in the world of genetics, a 10% shift in a genetic marker across an entire population is a massive, definitive statistical shift.
It is undeniable. But here's the truly shocking, heartbreaking part of the data.
It's the second generation.
When they tested the adult offspring of these survivors, the second generation, children who were born in America or Israel, who never set foot in a camp, who never experienced starvation or violence, they found that their FKBP5 gene had 7.7% lower methylation at the exact same site.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm grasping the magnitude of this.
Yeah.
So the parents' genes dialed the volume knob one way to suppress the terror and survive, and the children's genes were born with the knob dialed in the complete exact opposite direction.
Yes. Because the parents' genes were highly methylated, the biological message sent to the offspring was, you are about to be born into a horrific high-threat environment. You need to be ready.
Oh my God.
So the offspring were born hypomethylated. Their DNA was left wide open, exposed. They were born with an altered, highly sensitive, wildly hyperreactive nervous system. They were biologically primed for a high-threat environment that they hadn't even experienced yet. Their stress receptors were turned up to maximum volume from the day they were born.
Which leads perfectly and tragically to this psychological concept the paper introduces by scholar Marianne Hirsch, called post-memory.
Post-memory is a powerful framework. It describes the phenomenon where the children of survivors feel the trauma of their parents so deeply, so viscerally, that they experience post-traumatic symptoms of their own, despite having no personal memory of the trauma.
Like actual symptoms.
We are talking about the second generation having vivid, terrifying nightmares of selections of guards, of persecutions that they never lived through. The trauma of the parent becomes the inherited memory of the child.
And the research heavily notes that this transmission was wildly exacerbated by cultural silence. The taboos surrounding the horrors of the camps, specifically things like the camp brothels, the forced sexual labor that female survivors endured.
Right, because nobody talked about it.
Because it was simply too horrific, too shameful for society to speak about, the families couldn't process the truth. The trauma remained completely unintegrated, hidden in silence, and therefore it became biologically highly transmissible.
It festered.
So what does this all mean? When you really sit with this, it is staggering. It means the environment your grandparents lived in didn't just give you family stories around the dinner table or cultural traditions. It literally, physically calibrated the volume knob on your DNA stress receptors before you were even a thought in your parents' minds.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains a massive public health reality. The dissociation and compartmentalization kept that first generation alive in an unimaginable hell. It was an adaptive, brilliant evolutionary success.
But there's a cost.
But because it was left unintegrated due to silence and shame, the biological bill comes due in the offspring. That second generation exhibits vastly elevated rates of generalized anxiety disorder at 18.4% and depression at 13.7%. The unintegrated survival tool of the parent literally becomes the psychopathology of the child.
But the paper doesn't just leave us with that despair. It does offer an antidote, a contrast, to show how this chain can be broken. It briefly looks at a qualitative study of the lost boys of Sudan.
Yes, this is a crucial point of hope. The researchers looked at young men who survived extreme, relentless violence, forced displacement, and starvation during childhood in Sudan.
Similar levels of intense structural trauma.
Yes. Yet, despite horrific trauma profiles, many of them were able to rebuild their lives in new countries, integrate into communities, and actively process that extreme loss without passing it on as pathology.
How did they do that?
The key difference between them and the unintegrated trauma models was that they actively utilized a unifying spiritual framework, in their specific case, a deeply shared Christian faith and community, to process their grief collectively.
They didn't do it alone.
They maintained a sense of greater purpose, and they integrated the trauma into a cohesive shared narrative rather than locking it away in silent shame. It proves that transgenerational resilience and healing are biologically possible when trauma is actively socially processed rather than silently compartmentalized.
Which is a beautiful, vital testament to human resilience. But we have spent all this time talking about how dissociation is a shield. It protects the child, it protects the survivor, it's passed down to protect the offspring.
Right.
But there is a horrifying flip side to this shield. What happens when the person doing the uncoupling isn't the victim, but the perpetrator? Because we have to pivot now to the final and arguably the most difficult part of this deep dive, ethical duplicity and the psychology of atrocity.
This is where the theory gets really dark.
We have explored the tragedy of the victim's dissociation. Now we have to look at the absolute darkest vulnerability of the dual prism. how the perpetrator uses compartmentalization to commit unspeakable evil while feeling perfectly subjectively normal.
It is the most extreme, horrifying manifestation of the dual prism theory. To understand how humans are capable of this, the paper draws heavily on the foundational work of psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and his exhaustive study of World War II genocide, specifically his landmark book, The Nazi Doctors.
Lifton set out to answer a question that haunts all of history. He wanted to understand how highly educated, civilized, sophisticated healers, physicians who took the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, men who studied at the finest universities in Europe, could transform into active bureaucratic participants in systematic mass murder in the concentration camps.
And what he found was deeply unsettling, because it wasn't what people wanted to hear. He didn't find that these men were psychopathic monsters in the clinical textbook sense. They weren't rabid sociopaths.
They were normal guys.
What he identified was a highly sophisticated psychological mechanism that he called doubling.
How is doubling different from, say, multiple personality disorder?
In dissociative identity disorder, the distinct identities often have amnesia between them. They don't know the other exists. Doubling is different.
Okay.
In doubling, there is still a unified ego, but the individual divides their self-system into two fully functioning autonomous wholes that operate with entirely conflicting moral codes simultaneously. It is a conscious structural partition of the moral center.
The paper breaks this down into two distinct identities for these physicians, the Auschwitz self and the humane self.
Exactly. In the brutal, anomalous environment of the camps, these doctors developed an autonomous, highly specialized Auschwitz self. This self was completely freed of normal ethical standards.
It did the killing.
It was the self that stood on the ramp and supervised selections for the gas chambers, the self that conducted lethal, torturous medical experiments and enforced camp discipline. And crucially, this Auschwitz self actively rationalized these actions.
How do you rationalize that?
It convinced itself that it was performing a necessary, difficult medical procedure to heal the German state by removing an infection.
So it twisted the medical oath to serve mass murder. And while that horrific self was operating, the original humane self was still perfectly intact, running in the background.
Yes. The humane self was guided by traditional medical ethics, deep parental duty, and social responsibility. These doctors would literally finish a shift on the ramp at Auschwitz, condemning thousands to death, and then go home to their quarters and be loving husbands.
It's sickening.
They would write affectionate letters to their wives, they would read bedtime stories to their children, they would listen to Beethoven and weep at the beauty of the art.
And the doubling is what prevents their brain from simply exploding from the sheer weight of cognitive dissonance, right? If you believe you're a good person, but you are murdering children, your brain should collapse.
It should, yes.
But doubling allows them to bypass their own moral code while maintaining a pristine, subjective feeling of personal goodness. They didn't feel evil. They felt like professionals doing a gruesome, necessary job for their country and then going home to be good fathers. It's absolutely terrifying because it's so banal.
It is terrifying because it highlights a profound structural vulnerability in all human brains. We all have the machinery for this. This extreme individual-level splitting is closely related to a broader societal concept Lifton developed called psychic numbing,
Which he originally observed in a very different context. Yeah. In the survivors of the Hiroshima atomic bombing.
Yes. In the face of overwhelming apocalyptic trauma, seeing a city incinerated in a second, the survivors experienced a drastically diminished capacity to feel anything at all. It was profound emotional closing off.
To protect themselves.
It allowed them to physically walk through the rubble and survive the horror, but it led to a lasting, profound desensitization to human suffering. Lifton later applied this exact concept to modern society, arguing that we use psychic numbing every day to withdraw our attention from massive existential threats like global nuclear proliferation or climate change.
This is too much to handle.
The threat is so incredibly big, so unmanageable, that our brains just detach from the emotional reality of it to keep us functioning.
The paper calls this specific phenomenon the collapse of compassion. It's this psychological glitch where we are highly motivated, eager even to help one single identifiable victim, but we become completely emotionally numb to the abstract suffering of millions.
Exactly.
And I want to grapple with this because I want you, the listener, to really think about how you consume the daily news. We all do a micro version of this every single day. We scroll past headlines and statistics of mass suffering, war, famine, because a number like 1 million displaced people is just too big for the mammalian brain to process.
It's entirely abstract.
abstract.
Yeah.
But we will immediately pull out our credit cards and donate $500 to a GoFundMe for one person's sick dog, because there is a picture, a name, and a narrative we can control. And I have to ask, is this numbing a failure of our morality? Are we bad people for this? Or is it just a hard limit of our biology?
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important philosophical question of the entire synthesis. The data strongly suggests it is fundamentally a biological limit, the protective, decoupling mechanism of dissociation that ultimately facilitates moral failure.
Oh, it's biological.
Because our brains literally cannot process the pain of a million people without entering a dorsal vagal freeze state and shutting down our ability to function,
Wow.
we compartmentalize. We numb ourselves to survive the modern information landscape.
We turn it off.
And by using the mind's inherent ability to compartmentalize, human beings can become completely functionally indifferent to absolute atrocity simply by scrolling past it. It is the darkest side of the prism.
Wow. We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. Let's try to pull this massive concept all together. The dual prism theory posits that dissociation is not just a glitch, a breakdown, or a psychiatric failure. It is a structural amplifier of human potential.
A completely neutral tool.
The exact same neurological mechanism, that deep 3 Hz oscillation, that physical decoupling of the prefrontal cortex from the emotional and sensory centers, that causes a freezing animal to play dead in the jaws of a predator. That exact same mechanism allows a maestro to write a masterpiece in a state of flow.
It does.
It allows a shaman to lead their tribe on a spiritual journey. It allows a survivor to endure the unimaginable horrors of a concentration camp. And terrifyingly, it allows a doctor to commit a genocide and go home to kiss his kids goodnight.
It is the ultimate, powerful, double-edged survival mechanism. The capacity to compartmentalize, to unplug from reality is absolutely essential for navigating high-stakes environments. We need it.
We couldn't survive without it.
But its chronic, unintegrated presence leads to massive cognitive fragmentation, economic impulsivity, devastating transgenerational trauma, and profound ethical splitting. The goal of both the individual and society must be integration. We have to balance the immediate, necessary benefits of dissociative protection with the hard, long-term, painful work of emotional processing, narrative building, and holistic healing.
And as we wrap up this journey, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on what we've just discussed about modern life.
Consider this reality. In our modern era of constant, relentless information overload, the 24-hour news cycle, the endless digital scrolling on our phones, we are essentially practicing low-level, self-induced dissociation every single day.
Every time we open our phones.
We are constantly, willingly decoupling our attention from our physical reality to exist in a digital space. The question you have to ask yourself is, are we using this incredible psychological tool to intentionally build our own flow state masterpieces, or are we just slowly, passively numbing ourselves to the reality of the world and the people right in front of us?
That is a very heavy question to sit with. Remember that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning of the hour?
Yeah.
How we desperately want things to be clean, broken, or not broken.
Yeah.
The human mind isn't clean. It's muddy, it's infinitely complex, and it is capable of holding the most beautiful creation and the absolute darkest destruction in the exact same biological space. We want to thank you so much for joining us on Today in the Hypothesis.
Thanks for listening.
We urge you to take this information, integrate this knowledge into your life, stay deeply curious about your own mind, and please take a moment to subscribe to the show and share this deep dive with that one friend who is always fascinated by the hidden, complex wiring of human behavior. Until next time.